Hey everyone, welcome back to another week in Intro to Biblical Hebrew. What we're up to today is finishing off that chapter we started last session. If you recall there, we looked at a few pages in Ross where he dealt with independent personal pronouns. So those were our he, she, it, you, they, I, we words. We looked at those, we saw that they can show up on their own in a sentence. But when they do that, they'll always relate to the subject. That was a really helpful thing to know about the syntax. And we also noted that they could be used alongside of verbs to show emphasis. We talked around a few different types of uses, their form and their function. And we're going to really build on that today. But I want to start by sharing some good news. There's almost next to nothing that is new in this section. We'll have to learn a few new forms. But in terms of the grammar that we'll be using to kind of overlay those forms, it's coming directly out of what we've learned about adjectives. So here again are one of those spots where we seem to be pressing forward, but by pressing forward, we're actually forced to go back and look at some other things in the grammar and syntax of other topics we've already dealt with. So we'll be dealing with what we'll call demonstratives today, demonstrative pronouns, demonstrative adjectives. Once we have a handle on these forms, then it's simply a matter of applying what we already know from the grammar from a few sessions back. So let's have a look at these things. All right, so since the grammar that we'll be getting to, as you said, is really not new, but the forms are new, at least some of them, why don't we start here by looking at forms, and then we'll talk functions. So related to our IPPs, those independent personal pronouns, are what we're going to call demonstrative pronouns and demonstrative adjectives. Now, we're calling those pronouns or adjectives based on their use, but they will all take the same form. It's only one table that we need to know, and it's this one right here. It's this one where we have these 8 forms, although you see even there's some overlap in between them. So we'll call these our demonstratives, pronouns and adjectives. It's one table. One thing I thought would be helpful to note right off the bat is what we're getting at here is different degrees of definiteness or specificity, if you will. If we think back about where we've been so far in Hebrew, we've started off with indefinite nouns. So if we take the noun for a man or a person, an indefinite translation of a person would just be ish, a person, a man. Now we shortly after that looked at the definite article, and we wanted to recognize that if we were going to say the person, the man, it would be ha-ish, with that ha on the front end being our definite article. Now really what we're talking about here today are demonstratives to add even a greater degree of specificity to that kind of ranking, where if we wanted to say this person or this man, we would say something like ha'ish hazeh, ha'ish hazeh. And there what you're hearing is we're using a form like this. We'll talk about the function and the grammar of that in a moment, but I thought this would be a good place to kind of pause and reflect on the different ways that something can be definite in Hebrew, definite article or a demonstrative now, and of course it goes without saying the one that we don't have on this list are proper names and place names that are by their very nature definite. So that's a bit of review kind of right out of the gates. Now let's look at this table. It's split into 2 sections. We're going to have what we'll call near demonstratives and far demonstratives. Now, you can't see me, I'm doing this by myself, but I'm pointing to something, and if you want to say something is far, then you will say that or those. We do this all the time in English. If you're addressing something that's far away from you, you'd say that man or those men or that person or those people, whatever it may be. So this lower half of the table here is all of those what we'll call far demonstratives, that or those. Now, upstairs in the top half, what we're going to call near demonstratives, and these are things if you want to indicate something specific that's closer to the subject. This person or these people. Again, those would be things that are closer. So think of yourself as pointing to that or those items over there, whereas the near ones are this or these, the ones that are closer that are present. So let's call that a little bit of review, a little bit of understanding what we mean by near and far demonstratives. Now let's walk through this paradigm a little bit. It's actually quite familiar to us already as we see, probably about half of the forms we've already looked at. So what do we want to know about it? Let's start with the things we've seen before. What we can see here already is that some of our independent personal pronouns are in fact pulling double duty. So many of them will function in fact as a demonstrative. And that's basically the lower half of the table, our far demonstratives, who, he. We saw those already as our third masculine and third feminine singular pronouns. The he, ma, he, na on the other side as well are familiar to us. So this paradigm might be new, but the forms that we've already seen before, we can just kind of recognize them here as serving a different function, and we'll talk about those functions in a minute. But for now, get used to seeing those and having to make a decision. Is this a pronoun, an independent personal pronoun, or is it functioning as a demonstrative? And there again, we'll have to test that out in translation and have a few insights into context and grammar that we'll get to in a moment. The other forms that we could look at that are new, what we're really talking about then is only 3 new forms. So for an entire table, there's only 3 new forms, and we'll just look at these briefly. On the singular side, we have ze, that would be this. Ha-ish, ha-ze would be this man or this person. Or zot would be the feminine singular. Zot is what you would have for a feminine singular. So ze and zot are singular. We'll see those quite a bit. So again, my recommendation for these tables would be to make those their own vocabulary items in your lists or flashcards, however you're studying, and just memorize them as this or feminine or this masculine, and you'll be fine. Now, on the other side of the equation here, on the plural side, I should say, we get 2 for 1. Ele means simply these. That's the only form to know whether it's masculine or feminine for a plural demonstrative. So there, what we're getting is this whole table comes down to just 3 really different forms and a perhaps different perspective on forms that we already know. So we've walked through the forms, the paradigms. I would say know this paradigm, but more importantly, jot down a few of those new forms in your vocab list to get a handle on them. Once we have a sense of those forms, then we're in a good shape to go and have a look at some of their grammatical functions and what we mean by differentiating between pronouns and adjectives with demonstratives. So let's have a look at some of those guidelines now. All right, here's where the review comes in. As we know from our adjectives chapter, this is a little while back now, adjectives are those words that function to describe something about a noun. They modify it. And one of those types of adjectives that we saw was what we called our attributive adjectives. And that's where we're going to be drawing on some of that grammar here. When we want to think of an example, perhaps an easy example of what a demonstrative adjective would look like in English, the one that always kind of jumps to my mind is if you have a courtroom drama on TV in a movie, and you have a lawyer or a prosecutor, somebody pointing at the stand and saying, "This man," that would be a perfect example of a demonstrative adjective. It's adding specificity to a man, not any man in the room, but specifically the one on the stand. This would be functioning as a demonstrative adjective. But in Hebrew, the form there is more or less working like an attributive adjective as well. So this is where we'll do a little bit of review along the way. So as their name suggests, we see here demonstrative adjectives are functioning adjectivally. Surprise, surprise. So how are they functioning? Well, in this case, what we're going to be looking for are those signs that we got used to looking, being on the watch for our attributive adjectives. And I want to remind you of that one kind of simple phrase, 3 agree. What we said with our attributive adjectives is they will agree with the nouns that they modify in 3 ways. They'll agree in gender, so they'll either be both feminine or both masculine. Number, they will agree. And definite status. They will either both be definite or both be indefinite. So remember 3 agree. Don't forget this one, because that will give you a better chance at identifying these here, and our grammar that we learned a while ago will pay off again. We also said for our attributive adjectives that word order was going to be an important thing for helping identify some of these items. Not all the time, but word order can be typically said that the demonstrative adjective, like attributive adjectives, will follow the noun that they modify. So we'll get used to seeing this, these adjectives after the nouns in any kind of chain. Now, where things do, I guess, get a bit different, or can get more complicated, I should say, is in cases like with this last point. Because if we had a situation where we have a noun that is modified by an adjective as well as by a demonstrative, then we would want to pay attention to the position of those three forms together. So to return back to our courtroom drama scene, if we wanted to say this large man, this would be the demonstrative, large would be the adjective, and man would be the noun that they're both modifying. Now in Hebrew, if that was going to happen, we would see the following construction. We would probably see the noun first. We would see the adjective next, so in our example, large. And then the last item would be the demonstrative. We've seen this a few times, that Hebrew works off of word order as a grammatical, to indicate grammatical functions, more so than English perhaps. And this is one that's helpful to remember. Noun, adjective, demonstrative. We'll see that in a few examples perhaps in our readings, but for now just kind of tuck that away and remember that in that case all of those things would have that 3-agree rule. So we don't have a complex example to look at, but I did want to look at one specific one. This comes from Genesis, the Joseph story. I should have written down the passage for us now that I think of it, but Joseph 37, or Genesis 37, somewhere in there. This is that scene where after Joseph has risen up into the Egyptian household of Potiphar, and his wife is accusing him of some sort of sexual assault, and she says, or the scriptures say this, it says, "And she told him, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and I cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Now, the translation that we have here, right here, "and she told him," that is actually this form here. There's no verbal form, as our English translation suggests, but it's actually a demonstrative adjective. Kadvarim ha'ela. Kadvarim ha'ela. Now let's just chop this up a bit and we can see what's happening. There we go. Devarim, we know that's our plural word, davar, meaning words. We have at the front of that our inseparable preposition k, judging by the patach and the dagesh as well. In the dalet, we know that it means there's a definite article. So something like according to the words. Now, where we get the translation for these is in this form, ela. That's our that was the form we had that did double duty for our plural. In this case, a masculine plural with a definite article on the front. So we can say that these forms agree in gender and number. So they agree there. We could say that the demonstrative is coming after the noun, so that would be suggestive. But most important is that they both have a definite article. Ha and the patach is indicating that. So we have our 3-agree rule. A literal translation of this would be according to these words. According to these words. Where these words is functioning as a demonstrative adjective. So there what we're doing is drawing on some of our old grammar, throwing a new form in there, and in this case kind of needing to massage the translation so that it works in English. But I hope you get the point that what we're looking at is really just a new application of an old rule. So that's demonstrative adjectives. Think attributive adjectives in terms of the way they function. Now let's look at one last type of adjective, demonstratives rather, and then we'll move on. All right, so here's our last slide in this short podcast for today. We're going to look at now demonstrative pronouns. So the same forms from our very first table that we saw, but now functioning differently in the sentence. Now you may have guessed already where this is going with our previous example of demonstrative adjectives functioning in the same way that our attributive adjectives functioned. These are going to function in the same way as more or less as our predicate adjectives. So let's just do a little bit of review of those as well as some insights into our demonstrative pronouns here. What we're looking at is the use of those pronouns to function as a subject in a sentence. So if our example from our English example from the last slide was this man in that kind of courtroom setting, here we're talking about if we were to say this is the man or this is the person, pointing your finger at somebody on the stand again. There, if we drilled down to the grammar, we would arrive at the conclusion that that use is, yes, it's still a demonstrative, but it's functioning pronominally, so it's a demonstrative pronoun. It will always relate to the subject of a sentence, which is helpful to remind ourselves of, but their function and the clues that we look for to identify them in a Hebrew sentence are going to be the clues and the things that we learned for these ones here, for our predicate adjectives. So our predicate adjectives were marked by not three agree, in fact, but by agreement only in gender. So nouns and adjectives, as well as nouns and pronouns, would agree in gender. They'd agree in number. But the big one for us here is disagreement in definite status. So we're looking for disagreement in definite status between the noun in one of these chains and the pronoun. So that grammar is the same grammar we picked up weeks ago for our adjectives. If you knew it then you know it now. If you didn't pick it up then go back and look there and make sure you can apply it here as well. So that agreement and disagreement is going to be really critical for us. We could also say that word order, in the same way as it was for our last examples, was suggestive. Word order is important for us here. Demonstrative pronouns will typically precede the nouns they modify. This was also true of our predicate adjectives. So there again, if you knew that there, then you're in good shape now. So formally, we're looking for that gender and number agreement, disagreement and definite status. These will typically come before the noun. That's if we have a simple construction of a noun and a demonstrative. As we saw in our last slide, though, it is possible to have some more complex examples, not terribly complex, but we have one more form in there. Again, if we had a situation where we had a noun and an adjective modifying the noun, as well as a demonstrative adding specificity. So this is the large man, again, to kind of look at a similar example that we used from our last slide. In those cases, in Hebrew, what we would expect is the following. We would see the demonstrative up front, the noun in the middle, and the adjective following. Now, in this construction, what we would need to be on the lookout for is that noun and adjective. Again, so if we're saying, just use that English example, this is the large man, that noun and that adjective would be in full agreement. Here, however, the demonstrative would be in disagreement with this entire chain in terms of its definite status. Also, what we see is that demonstrative is positioned right out front. It's giving itself away. So here, again, even though we've said this is a more complex example, really it's not. It's just looking at those simple rules. And in a situation like this, if you translated the noun and adjective correctly, by seeing the demonstrative right up front, it would be a telltale sign it's giving you a demonstrative pronoun use. So that's a little bit of the grammar in terms of how to recognize one of these things out in the forest when you're hiking by yourself. Now let's look at just one brief example, and a really simple example, probably the easiest one to find, in fact, in the Hebrew Bible, or at least one of the ones that comes to mind for me, is that opening line in the book of Deuteronomy, that all-important book of the second law in the Pentateuch. And it starts off with this. It says, "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan." Now, as you can see here, the opening line, opening phrase, "These are the words, Elah hadavarim, ela hadavarim. What we're getting there is a demonstrative pronoun. And if we look at the grammar of it, we can identify that as such. The first thing we could note is the demonstrative is right up front. That's a suggestion to us right away because of the word order. We could also look and kind of carve this up a little bit and see that in fact what we have is agreement in gender and number. Remember, ele was our plural. In this case, functions a masculine plural, where we have agreement with devarim. They're both plural, they're both masculine. But where we're seeing that disagreement is we have a definite article on the front end of our noun. But if we go back here, we see that we don't have any definite article up front. There's disagreement there, therefore this must be a predicate adjective or a predicate demonstrative pronoun in this situation. So what we would do to translate that is say these are the words. And in English, because we need verbs even in these phrases, we would simply provide our simple form of our verbs to be, is, are, were, was, those types of things. So that's a short tour through the second half of that chapter in Ross for this week. Really dealing in some of the things we've already dealt with for the last couple of weeks, specifically adjectives, as well as some of the lessons learned from our independent personal pronouns. Again, my advice would be treat these as vocab items, run through the paradigm and have a firm handle on that, but knowing the kind of gloss and the parsing for each of these will be really important when you're looking at translating a phrase that involves a demonstrative, because you'll need to know its basic translation, this, that, these, those. You'll want to know if it's a near or a far demonstrative, judging by the context, as well as you'll want to know those forms for their person, gender, and number. All of those things are going to be helpful for determining how to translate based off of that grammar that we learned for our adjectives.